Okay, let's move on to issue 4. How do you think this health crisis will impact the presidential election? Clarence.
Well, for one thing, if you had any doubts about the importance of health care as an issue, I think you're going to, that should be wiped away by now. That and just how, of course, that was Bernie Sanders' issue. He's not around anymore, but Joe Biden gave a speech just as it was starting to take off, and that was like a presidential speech. And he had to look presidential, and he passed that test. I think that's going to be a factor in this race, but also how unpresidential President Trump looked, at least initially, as he tried to get control of this situation. A lot of people got really nervous from Wall Street on across middle America about can he handle this? I will say that Americans on the whole really stood up and done a great job just on the grassroots level.
I'll tell you what, if this happened in October, President Trump would not be winning re-election. I think the benefit here right now, the only thing working in President Trump's favor is time. It's March right now. There's still time for the economy to recover. Given what we've seen from Japan and from South Korea, people are starting to go back to work. I don't know about Wuhan, China, in terms of Starbucks reopening. We can only trust it with a grain of salt.
We know where we can finally get coffee at least.
That's true. But at the same time, obviously the longer this goes out, the more it hurts the economy. Dow Jones shrunk by 1/3 within the last 2 weeks. That's terrible for President Trump.
Right.
And the one thing, the blue chip that President Trump always had was the economy. That goes south, so do his re-election chances.
Well, Eleanor,
the weekend that the Fed lowered the interest rates to near zero, and then that Monday morning the stock market opened and crashed yet again. I think that really got to President Trump, who really does kind of measure his performance and his re-electability by the strength of the stock market. So somebody asked me the other day, has an incumbent president ever been reelected in a time of recession? I think the answer has got to be no, but this is a different kind of business. It's not a business recession, it's a health thing. And I think the voters will decide in November whether they think this president performed well on a health crisis. I think the jury's very much out on that. I think the answer is no now. But as you point out, he has time to recover.
Susan.
I think you have to look at some key numbers to try to guess, which is all we can do, how things will look months from now, which is almost impossible because we don't know what's going to happen next, really, given the volatility of the situation. But there's a new poll out that has his approval rating on this very issue at 55%.
I saw that.
Overall.
It's big.
Yeah.
And I don't think
Just
people are
came
going to
out.
remember the stuff you guys are talking about, the way he may have stumbled out of the gate. I think they're going to look at how he does now going forward. And the second thing they're going to look at, people always vote thinking of their bank accounts. Now, the president has always scored well. Look, people don't like his personality, but they like how he handles the economy. And they may look to him to be the person over the Democratic Party to be able to lead us economically out of this, more so than Joe Biden, because he helped bolster the economy when he became president in 2017, and they may see him as the person who's able to deliver us from this crisis right now.
Well, Clarence, that raises a fascinating point because we're going to live or falter as far as the economy goes. If the president can find a way to plow our way through this, then certainly there'll be some heroism there. But what do you think people are looking for from the president as it relates to his electability come November?
Well, they got a good old standby leadership, being able to take the reins and inspire people. This is really kind of like what he calls himself, a wartime president. I mean, this is a almost warlike situation politically, very much like when George W. Bush got up after 9/11 and really seized the moment, both at the Twin Towers site and at the cathedral afterwards. He really set us on the course, saying, there's somebody in charge there in Washington who can inspire the nation and help lead us forward. Donald Trump is still working on that.
Well, what do we do if we're getting into the early fall, Eleanor, and we're still under some form of encouragement or order of sheltering in place? We have an election coming up in November. What if anything, can be done to keep that election intact? And I don't think that sounds like a crazy question because a lot of primaries have already been postponed and extended out.
Democrats, probably not Republicans, but Democrats worry that this president could postpone the election, that he could call some national, he actually has called a national emergency. So that is a concern. I think that would be such a flagrant abuse of our democratic system that he could not get away with it. But this election has got to be a judgment on his leadership. And right now, with the coronavirus untamed, many deaths likely. This is not like the 2008 financial crisis or the Great Depression. This is more like the 1918 Spanish influenza. We have more medical help available now, but what happens in November will depend a lot on whether this president can marshal the full resources of the government by November or earlier and get this under control. I think right now the answer is he hasn't done it.
I don't think President Trump's going to postpone the election. I don't think he has the unilateral authority to do that. After all, states hold their own elections. They have control over whenever they hold their own elections. With respect to how President Trump is handling this, the wartime president that you brought up, Clarence, that's very much how he's handling it right now. The type of unity that we're all in this together, you haven't seen that type of unity in the United States since right after 9/11. And this might be President Trump's defining moment. We all thought President Obama was going to lose in 2012 to Mitt Romney until Superstorm Sandy happened, and you had that moment of bipartisanship between him and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who was a very vocal critic of Obama at that time. That saved his election.
The Detroit auto bailout helped too.
Well, of course, yeah. Well, obviously that helped. But Joe Biden, he definitely has a lot more. He resonates a lot more with independents than say a Bernie Sanders would. Right. So there's still, I think the urgency is on Trump to perform up to the standards of the Oval Office and actually meet the expectations of a lot of Americans who did not have their trust in him before.
Susan, is there any talk on Capitol Hill as it relates to the protection of the November elections? Has there been any kind of a conversation or a thought process about what we can do? Certainly it's administered at the state level, but is there a role for Congress anywhere in terms of trying to keep everything on track for November?
There's a real resistance. Parties don't really agree a lot on election security, period. For example, Republicans want to keep it controlled by the states and let them handle a lot of security issues while providing the funding to help them do that. And that's what we've seen so far. Democrats have pushed ideas that would more federalize elections. And Republicans have resisted that because they want to keep the control at the local level, which they think would be more effective. I know there's talk about mail-in ballots. You will hear more talk about that, I think, depending on what happens with the progression of this pandemic. But I think that that's going to be part of the discussion. How do we let people vote if we're not, by then, God forbid, still having this prohibition on large gatherings? How do we pull this off? Not many. I think there's one or two states that have.
There's several. I mean, it's Utah, Washington State, I think Oregon too.
Oregon has mail-in,
and they've increased the availability of that. You don't have
again,
to.
That's up to the states
An absentee
too.
ballot is available to everybody.
Right.
But if you
the federal role
centralize
is
or
money,
federalize elections,
yeah.
President
I
Trump
think
would have
we're
the
heading to
authority
that.
to probably postpone an election.
What they've done now is provide help, mostly about providing the states with the money to secure elections. Because let's face it, we've been talking about election security for a while now, given the incidents in the past two elections.
There's legislation that the House passed that the Republican Congress, Mr. McConnell, has not taken up. I think
that's got a lot of stuff in there that has nothing to do with election security.
I'd like to go to Clarence.
Sitting on McConnell's desk too.
I'd like to go to Clarence and just get one question out of the way that seems to be kind of ebbing below the surface. There's a gentleman by the name of Bernie Sanders who is still technically running. Where do you see this headed as far as he is concerned, and what impact has the quarantine and the whole crisis had as it relates to his election? Because he really had so much lift on these mass gatherings, and he was very eloquent. How do you see that playing out and impacting?
As I mentioned, healthcare certainly is an issue that's in front of people's minds now if it wasn't before. But the one thing that has changed now is the perception of Bernie being the great Pied Piper leader of young voters. Because young voters did not show up. And this is a cause of great discussion in our house with my Bernie Bros son.
Did he get out?
Old Daddy, I told you so comes along, you know.
Okay.
But you know,
that too.
yeah, you know, as I've said to him, you know, you deserve political power, and you're going to get it when you go out and show that you're going to vote.
Well,
Because otherwise,
yeah, Sanders has lost the last two. There were 3 Super Tuesdays. he lost all 3.
Right.
He's nowhere near Biden in the delegate count, but his support is critical, and I think the vice president has been very careful to try to reach out and to give Bernie credit. Yes, he did. He has had a great impact on the ideas that Democrats are discussing, the $15 an hour wage hike, certainly Medicare for all, and how that relationship has to be handled. But I think Sanders needs to get out of the race, and if there's another debate scheduled, it should be canceled.
Sanders also surprised, I think, with the Hispanic turnout that he drummed up out in California, Texas, et cetera. I'm sorry?
That didn't materialize later in the primaries either. But
he
he's
carried
needed.
California,
He's
the
needed.
big kahuna,
That's
and he
true.
almost got Texas. I mean,
That's true.
at Chicago, he did very well with Hispanics.
Are you saying
That's
that?
something we really
sorry,
need to
Claire,
take
go
a
ahead.
closer look at that, because Hispanics have not had great turnout in the past, and there's and Bernie learned all this in the last 4 years.
Yeah,
by
Bernie
the way.
can lead his revolution within the party.
And the thing that probably hurt Bernie
Final
Sanders
word.
the most is
Final
the
word.
fact that the Democratic National Committee doesn't have winner-take-all system. Think of where Bernie Sanders would be. He'd probably be neck and neck with Joe Biden if he say got all the delegates in California instead of a split vote.
We're
There's
going to
an
have
old debate in the
to
party
end it
there.
there.